There are structures in our world that leave modern people, with all of our technology, simply speechless. Ancient building methods, shrouded in mystery, raise countless questions that mainstream science tries to answer with simple explanations. One theory has become particularly popular recently. It explains how ancient builders could split enormous stones. The method, often shown in demonstrations, involves hammering a series of metal wedges into solid rock. Historians have eagerly adopted this technique, presenting it as a one-size-fits-all solution to the tough questions about ancient stonework. And on the surface, the method seems to work. But is it really the answer for everything? Was it truly used to create the most magnificent structures of the past? To find out, we must look at the most massive and mystifying example of all, the megalithic complex of Baalbek. This is the largest known structure ever built with colossal stone blocks. According to mainstream science, it was built around the 1st century AD and later expanded by others, including the Romans. However, this timeline raises far too many questions to be accepted without scrutiny, and as we continue, you'll see why. Let's put aside our assumptions and take a hard look at the official explanation for how this impossible masterpiece was made. We'll start at the very beginning. How were these colossal 1,000-ton blocks quarried and moved? Mainstream history gives us an answer. But let's examine it critically, using Baalbek itself as our case study to see if the official story holds up against the evidence. Let's take a closer look at this stone-splitting method that is so often offered as an explanation. According to the theory, the process begins with a careful analysis of the stone. Ancient masons would have to find a natural plane within the rock, a line of weakness where the stone would split most easily. Then, along this line, they would drill a series of holes at specific intervals, with the depth and diameter depending on the stone's size and structure. Special metal wedges, often paired with 2 shims to distribute the pressure, were inserted into these holes. Workers would then begin to methodically and gradually hammer the wedges, striking them in sequence. The synchronized and even increase in pressure would create immense tension inside the stone, eventually causing a crack to form and splitting the block along the desired line. On paper, and in small-scale experiments, it all seems logical and even elegant. However, the theory begins to break down as soon as we move from splitting a loose boulder to the task of extracting a giant monolith from a solid rock face. It's one thing to split an already quarried stone, but it's another thing entirely to cut it out of a mountain. To do this, you would need to separate the block not just along one plane, but along at least 4, and with incredible precision to get a perfect rectangular shape. But that's not all. Before you could even begin splitting, you would somehow have to first quarry the block, meaning you'd have to separate it from the bedrock underneath. The wedge theory doesn't explain how this was done. Let's assume the ancient builders somehow managed it, but such a crude method would inevitably leave behind characteristic marks. We would expect to see uneven, rough surfaces in the quarry and the remnants of the drill holes, the very holes for the wedges, on both the block itself and the place it was taken from. After being quarried this way, the block would still need extensive work to shape it correctly, chipping and grinding away huge amounts of stone to remove all the imperfections. But when we go directly to the Baalbek quarry, located just a few hundred meters from the temple complex, we see a picture that completely contradicts this convenient theory. Here in the rock face are gigantic, geometrically precise cavities from where the megaliths were removed. The walls of these cavities are astonishingly smooth and flat, with clean, almost perfect inner corners. There are no signs of drilling, no jagged edges from splitting with wedges. It looks as if the unknown builders used a gigantic tool that allowed them to cut blocks from the rock with surgical precision, like slicing butter from a stick. The most famous of the monoliths left here, known as the Stone of the South, is only partially detached from the bedrock. Its size and weight are astounding. But even more astounding is the technology used to shape it. We see clean, straight cuts that cannot be explained by the primitive method of hammering wedges. Furthermore, on the megaliths themselves, both those already used in the temple's foundation and those left in the quarry, there are strange holes of unknown purpose that don't resemble the technical drill holes needed for wedges. Perhaps they were used for some kind of clamps or lifting devices, but their true purpose remains a mystery. Thus, at the very first stage, the quarrying of the material, the official version faces insurmountable contradictions. The facts we observe at the Baalbek quarry do not just fail to support, but directly refute the theory of splitting with wedges. The method by which these colossal blocks were extracted from the rock remains unknown to us, and, by all appearances, it was incomparably more advanced than what we are led to believe. So, if the quarrying of the stone is already shrouded in mystery and calls into question our ideas about the capabilities of the ancients, what about the most difficult part? Moving these multi-ton giants to the construction site. Alright, let's move to the next stage, which presents researchers with an even greater challenge: transportation. Let's assume for a moment that the ancient builders somehow managed to cut perfectly shaped blocks weighing 1,000 tons or more out of the rock. Now they faced a problem that seems utterly impossible with the technologies attributed to them: how to get these monoliths from the quarry to the construction site. The distance, though relatively short at about 1 kilometer, becomes an insurmountable obstacle when dealing with such masses. The most common hypothesis proposed by supporters of the official version involves a system of rollers and human power. We are shown a picture of thousands of slaves straining with all their might, pulling on thick ropes to move a giant block slowly rolling on wooden or stone logs. This theory sounds plausible when we talk about blocks weighing 20, 30, or even 50 tons. Indeed, similar methods have been used throughout history, and their effectiveness for moderate loads is proven. But the entire logic of this system collapses as soon as the weight of the cargo exceeds a certain threshold and reaches the monstrous figures of 800 or 1,000 tons, as is the case with the megaliths of Baalbek, known as the Trilithon. Let's analyze this idea from the perspective of basic physics and material strength. Wooden rollers, even those made from the strongest types of wood, would simply be crushed into splinters under the pressure of 1,000 tons. The contact area of each roller with the block and the ground is very small, meaning the pressure at that point would be astronomical. No wood could withstand such a load. Okay, they might say, what if the rollers were made of stone? This only makes the problem worse. First, stone rollers themselves would have an enormous weight, which would have to be added to the weight of the block. This is additional dead weight that would also need to be moved. Second, stone is a brittle material. Under such colossal point pressure, any stone roller, whether granite or basalt, would very likely just shatter. And let's not forget the surface on which all this was supposed to roll. To move such a load, you would need a perfectly level and incredibly strong road, capable of withstanding pressure comparable to that of a heavy tank's tracks, but on a much smaller area. Any unevenness, any soft patch of ground, would lead to disaster. But that's not all. Let's say by some miracle, they found a material for the rollers and built a super strong road. Then comes the question of pulling power. What kind of rope, woven from plant fibers, could withstand the force needed to move a 1,000-ton mass from a standstill and also overcome the force of friction? Any such rope would simply snap. And how many thousands of slaves would be needed to provide the necessary pulling force? And how would you coordinate their simultaneous effort? This logistical task seems impossible. And now we come to the climax of this stage. The block didn't just need to be delivered to the base of the temple, it had to be lifted to a height of about 8 meters and set into the wall with incredible precision, ensuring a perfect fit with the neighboring blocks. Here, the theory of rollers and ropes becomes completely absurd. The idea of building a giant earthen ramp up which the blocks were supposedly dragged also fails to stand up to scrutiny. To haul a 1,000-ton block to such a height, plus the weight of the rollers and sleds, the slope of the ramp would have to be minimal. Otherwise, the force pulling the block down the slope would become insurmountable. This means the ramp would have had to stretch for hundreds of meters, and its volume would have been millions of cubic meters of earth. That would be a construction project in itself, comparable in scale to the construction of the temple. And where did this colossal ramp go afterwards? Not a trace of it remains. Thus, none of the proposed simple technologies, not rollers, not ropes, not ramps, can provide a coherent answer to how the megaliths of Baalbek were not only moved, but also lifted to a significant height. The scale of the task goes far beyond the capabilities of manual labor and primitive mechanisms. We are talking about masses that are extremely difficult to handle even today. Let's compare this to what our most advanced technologies are capable of lifting. You'll be surprised at how much the ancient builders, according to scientists, surpassed our modern engineering capabilities. To fully grasp the scale of the engineering challenge that the builders of Baalbek solved, we need to make a direct comparison with the capabilities of modern construction equipment. In our 21st century, the age of steel, hydraulics, and computer control, the main workhorse on any major construction site is the mobile crane. The standard lifting capacity of the machines we see everywhere is about 50 tons. This is more than enough for the vast majority of construction operations, installing concrete slabs, steel structures, and lifting equipment. It is a proven, effective, and economically sound technology. In some specific cases, such as the construction of bridges, industrial facilities, or the installation of heavy turbines, more powerful cranes are used, capable of lifting up to 200 tons. This is already serious and expensive equipment, requiring special site preparation and skilled personnel. Such cranes are the upper limit for most construction companies, and their use is always dictated by extreme necessity. But even these machines are no match for the tasks that face the creators of Baalbek. Are there cranes today that can lift 1,000 tons? Yes, they exist. But this is not mass-produced equipment. It's a true exclusive, a custom-made product manufactured by only a few corporations in the world. Monster cranes like the Liebherr LTM 11200-9.1 or giant crawler cranes from DMAG can handle loads of 1,200 and even over 2,000 tons. However, their use is fraught with enormous difficulties and limitations. First, these machines are incredibly expensive, both to produce and to operate. Second, they are huge and heavy, and transporting them to the worksite is a massive logistical operation in itself. Third, and most importantly, they can only achieve their maximum lifting capacity at a minimal boom radius, meaning the load must be almost directly at the base of the crane. The farther out or higher the load needs to go, the more dramatically the permissible weight drops. Furthermore, for such a giant to operate, it requires a perfectly prepared, solid, and level platform, capable of withstanding monstrous pressure. Often, special concrete foundations have to be poured for this purpose. If the ground is not firm enough, crawler cranes are used, which distribute the weight over a larger area. But they too have their limits. And here we encounter a stunning paradox. We, with all our modern knowledge, technology, and materials, in the overwhelming majority of cases, deliberately design and build structures to avoid the need for such super heavy and expensive equipment. Our construction industry is based on principles of modularity, standardization, and economic efficiency. We don't cut 1,000-ton blocks from quarries. We cast reinforced concrete components in pieces, which are then easily assembled by standard cranes. We look for easy and rational solutions. But the ancients, according to mainstream science, followed a completely different path. They, supposedly having nothing but bronze chisels, hemp ropes, and muscle power, deliberately set themselves tasks that today would require the most powerful, rare, and expensive machinery on the planet. They didn't look for easy ways, choosing to build with monoliths of a weight that makes modern engineers shake their heads in awe. This logic seems completely backward. It implies that a primitive society took on projects that a modern, high-tech society considers extremely complex and economically unfeasible. This is either evidence of some incredible lost knowledge, or a complete failure of the official theory that tries to explain the inexplicable with primitive methods. And if dealing with the horizontally laid 1,000-ton blocks of the trilithon already baffles our understanding of ancient capabilities, what can be said about the columns of the Temple of Jupiter, which still stand today, defying both the heavens and common sense? If working with horizontally laid megaliths seems like a technological miracle, the columns of the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek transport us to an entirely different reality, where the laws of engineering as we know them cease to apply. Of the once majestic temple that must have stunned the imagination of its contemporaries, only 6 columns have survived to this day. But even this small remnant of former glory serves as irrefutable proof of a lost technology. These 6 stone giants rise to a height of 22 meters, roughly the height of a 7-story building. Their diameter is about 7 meters, and they project an impression of absolute, unshakable power. But the most staggering part begins when we try to estimate their weight. A simple calculation based on their volume and the average density of stone yields a figure that the mind refuses to believe. Each column weighs around 1,500 tons. That's 50% heavier than the largest blocks of the famous trilithon that formed the foundation of the temple platform. But unlike the trilithon blocks, these colossi didn't just need to be brought and laid down. They had to be crafted with incredible precision, delivered, and, most unimaginably, set upright. Their surfaces are perfectly smooth and polished, attesting to the highest quality of workmanship. How could such a shape and smoothness be achieved on a 1,500-ton monolith? What kind of tools would be needed to carve such an object, as if on a giant lathe? Not a single archaeological artifact that could even hint at the existence of such tools has ever been found. Next comes the task of installation. Try to imagine the process of raising a 22-meter-tall column weighing 1,500 tons into a vertical position. Any theory about ramps, ropes, and thousands of slaves completely shatters against the rocks of reality here. This is an operation that requires not just brute force, but phenomenal control, coordination, and engineering calculation. The slightest mistake, uneven tension, a weakness in any part of the lifting mechanism, and the 1,500-ton mass would come crashing down, turning everything around it to dust and burying hundreds of people. The ancient builders needed not only to lift this weight, but also to place it with millimeter precision on a prepared base, without damaging either the column itself or the foundation. But even that, it turns out, was not the limit. As if to definitively shame future researchers, the creators of Baalbek added a cherry on top. Atop these 22-meter columns, they placed horizontal stone blocks, the architraves. Each section of these weighs about 80 tons. Today, lifting an 80-ton load to a height of 22 meters would require one of the most powerful mobile cranes with a long telescopic boom, and it would be considered a complex engineering operation. How did the ancients do it? How did they lift multi-ton blocks to such a height and carefully place them on top of the already standing columns? At this point, any arguments from mainstream science about primitive yet effective methods begin to seem not just unconvincing, but frankly absurd and foolish. They explain nothing, only creating an illusion of an answer. From childhood, we have been taught a paradigm of linear progress, from the primitive to the complex. But Baalbek completely shatters this worldview. It demonstrates a level of construction technology that in some respects surpasses even our modern capabilities. When we step back from the doctrines imposed on us since school, we realize we are facing a great mystery. We are so accustomed to the textbook versions that we don't question them, accepting on faith what fails to stand up to any practical scrutiny. But what if the truth is not waiting for us in textbooks, but in sources that are usually considered fiction, in the ancient legends and traditions of peoples. When the logic of modern engineering knowledge hits a dead end trying to explain the phenomenon of Baalbek, only one path remains: to turn to the most ancient memory of humanity, recorded not in scientific treatises, but in myths, legends, and folklore. What if we were to ask those whose ancestors lived on this land for centuries, who, in their opinion, erected these mighty and impossible structures? It turns out that the local Arab inhabitants have their own answers, which differ radically from the versions of official historians. They believe that in ancient times, Baalbek belonged to the legendary king Nimrod, who once ruled these lands. This figure, known from the Bible as a mighty hunter and the builder of the Tower of Babel, is strongly associated with an era of gigantism and audacious plans. Moreover, an ancient Arabic manuscript found in Baalbek itself contains a direct reference to the creators of the complex. The text states that King Nimrod sent giants to rebuild Baalbek after the Great Flood. This short sentence turns everything upside down. First, it dates the construction of Baalbek to a pre-flood era, making it far more ancient than mainstream science suggests. Second, it explicitly names the builders not as people of ordinary stature, but as giants, for whom working with multi-ton blocks might have been a routine task. This means the complex was not just built, but rebuilt after a global catastrophe, which only emphasizes its incredible antiquity and durability. Interestingly, local traditions also link the construction of Baalbek to another biblical figure, Cain, the son of Adam. According to these legends, it was he who built the first fortified settlement here, a kind of sanctuary, after being cursed by God. This version also takes us back to the very dawn of human history, to an era when, according to ancient texts, the world was very different. And although the stories of King Nimrod and Cain may seem like mere mythological plots, they are strikingly unanimous on one point. Baalbek is the creation of some ancient, powerful civilization, whose capabilities were incommensurable with our ideas of a primitive past. And this raises a key question. What should we believe? On one hand, we have the scientists' version of tens of thousands of slaves who, using primitive tools, ropes, and rollers, somehow managed to move 1,000-ton blocks. This version, as we have already seen, falls apart at the slightest contact with the laws of physics and engineering logic. It requires us to believe in miracles performed by brute force, in a labor organization unthinkable even for modern managers, and in technologies that left not a single trace behind. On the other hand, we have the legends of giants. At first glance, this seems like fiction, a children's fairy tale. We have been taught since childhood to perceive myths as allegories, not as historical chronicles. But let's set aside this skepticism for a moment. If we assume that the builders were indeed beings 8, 10, or 15 meters tall, then the whole picture changes. For such creatures, an 800-ton block would be equivalent to a concrete block weighing 80 to 100 kilograms for a modern person. It's still heavy, but quite manageable. Moving and setting such bricks ceases to be an unsolvable problem and becomes a routine construction job, albeit one requiring significant effort. In this context, the legend of the giants, paradoxically, sounds like a much more logical and plausible explanation for the phenomenon of Baalbek than the contrived and contradictory version of 75,000 slaves with chisels. The legend explains the scale, the technology, and the absence of primitive tools. Of course, stories of giants are always met with disbelief. But what if they are not just legends? What if they are echoes of real events, the memory of which has been preserved in folklore? Are legends just fairy tales? Or what if there is irrefutable physical evidence that giants did indeed once walk our Earth, leaving their footprints frozen in stone for eternity? The legends of giants cease to be mere folklore when we encounter physical evidence scattered across the entire planet. These are not artifacts that can be forged, nor texts that can be misinterpreted. These are petrified footprints, direct impressions of the feet of beings of incredible size, left in those distant times when the rock was still soft and plastic, like clay. These discoveries directly challenge the established picture of the past and force us to look at ancient myths in a completely new light. One of the most impressive examples is a discovery in Dragon Park, located just 400 kilometers from Vladivostok, Russia. There, on the surface of a rock, is a giant footprint, strikingly similar to a human's. The size of this print from heel to toe is 1.5 meters. The foot is fully imprinted in the rock, preserving its shape down to the smallest detail. This could only have happened if a creature stepped on the surface when it was soft, after which the rock petrified, preserving the print for millions of years. Simple calculations based on human body proportions suggest that the creature that left this track was between 8 and 10 meters tall. This is not just a tall person, this is a true giant from the legends. And this is by no means an isolated case. Reports of similar finds come from the most diverse corners of the world, confirming that in the past, our planet may have been inhabited by a race of giants. For instance, news portals reported a whole series of giant footprints discovered in southwest China, in Guizhou province. These tracks also point to creatures of enormous stature who once lived in the area. In Russia, on Mount Polyud in the Perm region, local legends have long spoken of a footprint left by an ancient hero. And this footprint actually exists, imprinted in the stone. An even more astonishing find was made by researcher Vyacheslav Plokov in Kazakhstan. He discovered not just individual tracks, but a whole series of prints, as well as the fossilized impressions of giant teeth. Analyzing the dimensions of one of the clearest footprints, the scientists concluded that the being who left it could have been an incredible 18 meters tall. During further research in this area, dozens of tracks left by giant creatures unknown to science were found. Similar prints are found on other continents as well. In Bolivia, in the Tarija Valley, giant footprints have also been discovered, which local inhabitants have long associated with mythical beings. This list could go on for a very long time. Hundreds of such footprints have now been found in almost every country and among all peoples of the world, and each is accompanied by local legends of giants who lived on this land in the old times. Mainstream science usually either ignores these findings or tries to explain them as peculiar forms of erosion or geological formations. But when we see a clear impression of a foot with 5 toes, an arch, and a heel, just magnified dozens of times, such explanations seem unconvincing. And here, all the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. On one hand, we have Baalbek, a megalithic complex impossible to build with primitive technologies and the strength of ordinary-sized humans. On the other hand, we have hundreds of physical proofs of a race of giants scattered across the entire planet. And between them is the connecting link in the form of ancient legends, the Bible, the Quran, and the traditions of all peoples of the world, which speak in one voice of a time when giants lived on Earth. Is this not the most logical and simple explanation? Baalbek may have been built precisely by those whom we call giants, people not of our size. For them, working with 1,000-ton blocks was as natural as laying bricks is for us. This assumption at once resolves all the technological contradictions that baffle modern science. But the giant stature of the builders does not negate, but rather suggests, that they also possessed high technologies. And these giants were not just enormous. The legends say they possessed knowledge and technologies that we can't even dream of. Ancient traditions, passed down by word of mouth for millennia, paint a picture of giants who were not just large, but beings endowed with incredible knowledge and technologies so far ahead of their time that we still cannot comprehend their nature. In South America, for example, legends are still preserved of tall, white giants who, according to ancient texts, dominated the continent several hundred years ago. These beings possessed certain secrets of magic, which is likely a metaphorical description of advanced technologies that were incomprehensible to the people around them. Their power was so great that they conquered the entire land. The traditions say their reign ended suddenly when the Almighty Great Spirit from the heavens destroyed the white giants, who, mired in pride, had forgotten justice and mercy. Similar traditions exist among the tribes of North American Indians. The Navajo people, for instance, also preserve legends about the life of giants on Earth. A story was passed down from father to son about giants of a royal race, white giants who possessed amazing skills in mining. They required vast amounts of clean water, which they extracted from the depths of the earth by creating deep wells. What is astonishing in these legends is the description of how the water rose to the brim of these wells on its own, as if by magic. Most likely, this refers to an understanding of hydrological processes, and perhaps the use of some ancient technologies for lifting water that we have yet to rediscover. Thus, when we consider all this evidence, both the monumental structures like Baalbek and the ancient legends of giants possessing unheard of knowledge, a logical conclusion emerges. The gigantic size of the builders is not, by itself, a sufficient explanation. On the contrary, it only reinforces the hypothesis that they possessed highly advanced tools and deep knowledge, the level of which may even surpass modern science. These ancient civilizations, whether they were the giants of legend or the unknown builders of Baalbek, held secrets that we are only now beginning to try to unravel. Baalbek is not just a pile of ancient stones. It is a living, monumental testament to a forgotten history of humanity. It is a monument to a civilization whose achievements and technologies still leave our modern knowledge speechless. It is a challenge to all our conceptions of the past, a call to rethink history and to admit that we know far less about it than we would like to believe. We are on the threshold of a great discovery, and the key to it may lie in unraveling the mystery of the ancient builders of Baalbek and their incredible lost legacy.